The universe had a name for Kalen Vance and his kind, Null. It wasn't a designation of rank or specialty. It was a diagnosis. In the sprawling outer celestial empire of the Concord, where the crystalline architectons reigned from their star-forged thrones, humanity was a managed resource, a species of tolerated vermin kept in line by a subtle, pervasive psychic hum that blanketed their colonies. It was the harmony. The architectons called it. A gentle pressure on the soul that sanded away the rough edges of ambition, rebellion, and inconvenient questions. But Kale, and the few like him, were born deaf to the song. They were gaps in the chorus, silent voids where the harmony could find no purchase. To the other humans, they were unnerving, their eyes lacking the placid glaze of Concord-approved contentment. They were seen as broken, soulless, incapable of feeling the divine touch of their overlords. The architectons, in their infinite and terrifying wisdom, found a use for their broken toys. Nulls were funneled into the Concord's auxiliary legions, specifically into sanitation units, a sterile name for the dirtiest job in the galaxy. They were the Concord's janitors, sent to mop up the bloody messes on the fringes of the Empire, the pirate infestations, the biological outbreaks, and, most frequently, the pathetic, short-lived uprisings of other subjugated species who had not yet learned that the only thing worse than living under the architecton's peace was dying to enforce it. Kale stood in the cramped deployment bay of the transport ship, unflinching resolve, the recycled air tasting of ozone and nervous sweat. He ran a gauntleted thumb over a fresh scratch on his pulse rifle, the gesture as familiar and comforting as a prayer he didn't believe in. Around him, his squad, Omega 9, performed their own pre-combat rituals. Jax, a mountain of a man whose armor was more weld than original plating, was sharpening a combat knife the size of a man's forearm, a low, guttural hum vibrating in his chest. He lived for the chaos, the one place a Null could feel something akin to purpose. Across the bay, Lena sat perfectly still, her back ramrod straight against a cargo container, her long-barreled kinetic rifle disassembled across her lap. She cleaned each component with a reverence that bordered on worship, her movements economical and silent. She hadn't spoken more than a handful of words since they'd left the orbital depot, but Kale could read her state of mind in the precise click of a firing pin being seated. She was calm, which was somehow more unsettling than Jax's bloodlust. And then there was Reese, the youngest, his face pale behind his helmet's visor as he triple-checked the data spike on his wrist gauntlet. Reese was the one who still held on to the foolish notion that they were something more than expendable assets. He talked of honor, of protecting the Concord's citizens, a concept so alien to Kale it felt like a different language. Kale had given up on honor the day he watched his first commanding officer get vaporized for questioning an architecton's order. Now, he fought for only two things the credits deposited into his account and the lives of the 3 people in this bay with him. They were all that was left of the original 12 members of Omega 9. They were heading for Xylos, a desolate mining moon orbiting a gas giant the color of a bruise. The mission was routine, another sanitation detail. The local workforce, an insectoid species called the Q-Thar, had gotten restless. They'd sabotaged mining equipment, attacked their overseers, and declared their independence from a hive queen they claimed was a conquered puppet. It was a story Kale had heard a dozen times in a dozen different systems. A holographic projector in the center of the bay flickered to life. coalescing into the towering, multifaceted form of an architecton. It shimmered with an internal light, its voice not a sound, but a series of perfectly modulated frequencies that resonated directly in their minds. Beings of harmony, it chimed, the salutation dripping with condescension. You are being deployed to restore order on the moon of Xylos. The chaotic elements of the Cuthar have been pacified. Their hive matriarch's defiant psyche has been realigned by our will. Your task is a simple cleansing. You will descend into the primary excavation and purge any remaining pockets of illogical resistance. There will be no significant opposition. Your purpose is to be a symbol of the Concord's infallible reach. The projection dissolved, leaving a lingering scent of static electricity. Jack spat on the deck, pacified. Last time they said that, on Dignus V, pacified meant the lizards had been given new plasma cannons. Kale didn't respond, but a cold knot tightened in his stomach. The architecton's promise felt like a lie wrapped in silk. Their promises always did. The landing was eerily quiet. Their drop pod sliced through Xylos's toxic, methane-heavy atmosphere and settled on a landing pad overlooking a vast, open-pit mine that scarred the moon's surface like a festering wound. The sky was a perpetual twilight, choked with rust-colored dust, a network of tunnels bored into the rock, leading down into the planet's metallic heart. Kyle's boots crunched on the metallic grit, the only sound in the oppressive silence. There were signs of a struggle, overturned cargo haulers, scorch marks on the walls of the main entrance, but there were no bodies, no Cuthar, no human overseers, just silence. Command. This is Omega 9. Kyle vocalized into his comm. We're on the ground. The LZ is sterile. No hostiles, no friendlies. It's a ghost town. The reply from the orbital command ship was tinny and distant. Proceed with the mission. Omega 9. Descend to the primary processing core. Secure the facility and await further instructions. Kyle gave the hand signal, and they moved into the maw of the mine, their helmet lamps cutting feeble beams through the darkness. The air inside was thick with the smell of ozone and something else, something acrid and organic. The tunnels were a labyrinth of alloy walkways and raw, hewn rock. Strange symbols were scrawled on the walls in a viscous, bioluminescent fluid, not the typical graffiti of a worker uprising, but intricate patterns, almost like circuit diagrams. Reese, what are you seeing? Kale murmured, his rifle sweeping across the shadowed alcoves. Reese's voice was tight with tension. It's wrong. Kale, the whole system is dark. Internal sensors, comms, atmospheric regulators. They haven't been smashed. They've been surgically disconnected, rerouted. The power conduits are all feeding into something deep below us, something that isn't on the official schematics. This wasn't a riot. This was an invasion. Before Kale could process the information, a sound echoed from the depths, a high-pitched chittering that multiplied until it became a deafening wave of noise. The floor began to vibrate. From every intersecting tunnel, every ventilation shaft, every crack in the rock, they came. The Cuthar. They weren't the lanky, semi-bipedal miners from the Conquered intelligence briefs. These creatures were twisted, their carapaces thickened and covered in sharp, bony spurs. Their multiple eyes glowed with a feral, red light, and the strange symbols from the walls were painted across their bodies. They moved with a speed and coordinated fury that defied their lanky forms, swarming over the walkways, their serrated claws screeching against the metal. Contact hostiles everywhere. Jax roared, opening up with his heavy repeater cannon, the weapon's thunderous report shaking the tunnel. He carved a swathe through the first wave, but for every one that fell, 3 more scrambled over its corpse. Lena was already in position, perched atop a massive piece of drilling equipment, her rifle cracking with methodical precision. Each shot found an eye socket or a joint in the carapace, dropping a Q-Thar with cold efficiency. But there were too many. Kyle and Reese laid down, suppressing fire, falling back toward a defensible choke point. The other human auxiliary companies, spread throughout the upper levels, were screaming over the comms. Their calls for support were met with the same chilling silence Kyle had heard from orbit. The harmony that was supposed to keep them safe, that was supposed to have pacified this world, was absent. It was a slaughter. Kale saw Company Gamma get overwhelmed, their position vanishing from his tactical display in a wash of static. He saw Captain Eva Rostova of Beta Company, a woman he'd shared a drink with 2 nights ago, dragged down into a chittering mob. This wasn't a mission. It was a charnel house. "They sent us here to die!" Reese gasped, his hands trembling as he fumbled with a plasma grenade. They knew. They knew this would happen. "Focus!" Kale barked, shoving him behind cover as a Q-Thar lunged, its claws tearing through the air where Reese's head had been. Kale put a 3-round burst into its chest, and it collapsed in a heap of twitching limbs. They were being herded, pushed deeper into the mine. The Q-Thar weren't just attacking, they were guiding them, forcing them down a specific path, a path that led directly to the central processing core. The core. They're forcing us to the core, Kale yelled over the din. "Jax, on me. We need to blow the main conduit." Jax let out a wild laugh, his cannon glowing red-hot. "Now you're speaking my language." He charged forward, a walking bastion of destruction, clearing a path for Reese to get to the energy conduit that powered the entire facility. But the Q-Thar were relentless. One of them, larger than the rest, with massive, scythe-like claws, leaped from the ceiling, landing directly on Jax. The big man roared in fury, not pain, as he was borne to the ground. Kyle saw the flash of Jax's combat knife, heard the wet crunch of carapace. But the swarm was on him in an instant. Jax's cannon fell silent. Reese screamed his name, momentarily frozen. It was all the opening the Q-Thar needed. A bony projectile, fired from the mouth of one of the creatures, slammed into Reese's side, punching through his armor and pinning him to the conduit's control panel. He looked down at the spike protruding from his gut, his eyes wide with shock, before slumping forward. Kyle Lena's voice was a whip crack in his ear. "We have to fall back now." Kyle grabbed Reese's demolition charges, his mind a maelstrom of rage and grief. He and Lena fired in retreat, covering each other as they fell back through a narrow maintenance tunnel, the sound of the swarm echoing behind them. They sealed the door behind them, the metal groaning under the immediate assault of claws and bodies. They were trapped, hundreds of meters below the surface, the last 2 survivors of a 300-person deployment. Kyle slumped against the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at the charges in his hand. Reese's blood already cooling on the casing. He had to know why. It wasn't enough for them to be betrayed. He had to know the reason. He found a small secondary comms relay panel on the wall, its emergency power still active. "Cover me," he said to Lena, his voice hollow. She didn't reply, but he heard the soft snick of her rifle's scope adjusting as she took up a position watching the door. His fingers flew across the panel, bypassing local security protocols, slicing through layers of encryption meant to keep human auxiliaries from accessing sensitive channels. He was searching for anything. A stray transmission, an after-action report, an explanation for the massacre. And then he found it. A single, tightly encrypted Arctecton data burst, transmitted from Xylos just as their drop pods were entering the atmosphere. It wasn't meant for human ears. Or any organic ears, for that matter. Kale's data spike struggled to translate the pure frequency communication, but it managed to render a cold, clinical text file onto his HUD. Subject Field Test 734 Xylos Purge. Agent Hyperaggression Pheromone Codename Fury. Target Species Q-Thar. Control Group Conquered Auxiliary Legion. 3rd Battalion. Objective measure combat effectiveness, degradation, and casualty rates of non-null human forces under sustained pheromone-induced assault. Preliminary data indicates a 98% casualty rate within the first operational hour. The agent is performing above projected parameters. The test is a success. Kyle read the words once, then twice. His world, already a bleak and unforgiving landscape, collapsed into a singularity of pure, undiluted hatred. They weren't soldiers. They weren't even cannon fodder. They were lab rats. Their deaths, the screams of his friends. The way Jax had been torn apart, it was all just a data point. The Architecton's serene, condescending voice echoed in his mind. Speaking of harmony and order, a low growl escaped his lips, a sound of such profound rage that Lena turned from the door, her rifle lowering slightly. Kyle looked at the data file, the cold, hard proof of their master's utter contempt for their lives. Then he looked at the demolition charges in his hand. Survival was no longer the mission. The gods of the Conquered wanted data, Kale thought, his hands slick with Reese's blood as he armed the last of their charges. He would give them a final result. The words of the Architecton's report scorched Kale's mind, not like a sudden explosion, but like acid eating through bone. He felt no rage. Not yet. Rage was a luxury, a blinding fire that consumed. What he felt was colder, deeper. It was a profound, crystalline clarity, born of absolute betrayal. They were not broken. They were free. Free from the harmony. Free from the illusion. Free to see the galaxy as it truly was, a slaughterhouse for anyone who didn't fit the Architecton's design. He looked at the demolition charges in his hand, the last remnants of Reese's naive hope, and then at Lena. Her rifle was still trained on the groaning door, her posture a rigid line of barely controlled tension. Her helmet was angled away, but he felt her gaze. A silent question. "They sent us here to die," Kyle stated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. He tapped the display on his HUD, mirroring the translated text to her internal comms. Jax, Reese, all of them. They were a control group, a scientific experiment to test a pheromone that drove the Q-Thar into a hyper-aggressive frenzy. Lena's head snapped towards him, her body unmoving, but the subtle shift in the tilt of her helmet spoke volumes. The placid mask of the Null's inner calm shattered, replaced by a raw, naked horror that even her disciplined mind couldn't fully suppress. The harmony. They knew, she whispered, her voice a brittle shard of ice. They used us. They cultivated the rebellion, then dropped us in the middle of it. No, Kyle corrected, his finger already on the activation switch of the charges. They are the rebellion. They stoked it, used it, and then they wiped the board clean with us. He looked at the charges again. Reese's blood was tacky on the casing, a stark, visceral reminder. They want data. I'll give them a data point. He slammed the charges against the main conduit, the magnetic clamps locking with a sharp thunk. A series of rapid beeps confirmed the timer was active 3 minutes. Lena didn't question. She simply nodded, her rifle swinging back to cover the door. The thudding, scratching, and chittering on the other side intensified, the Q-Thar sensing their presence, or perhaps the imminent explosion. "We need to move," she stated, her voice regaining its cold precision. Kyle agreed. They had nowhere to go, but staying was not an option. He found a disused ventilation shaft, barely wide enough for one person at a time, hidden behind a collapsed section of rock. "This way," he ordered, already squeezing into the cramped opening. Lena followed without hesitation, her rifle slung across her back, her movements fluid despite the confined space. They crawled for what felt like an eternity, the rough metal scraping against their armor, the air thick with dust, and the metallic scent of Q-Thar pheromones. Kyle counted the seconds in his head, the rhythmic pounding of his own heart amplifying the growing rumble that vibrated through the rock. 90 seconds. 60. 30. Then, the entire mountain shuddered. A muffled, concussive thumb crump tore through the moon, followed by a series of cascading collapses that turned the ventilation shaft into a roller coaster of falling debris and grinding metal. Kyle slammed his helmet against the ceiling, disoriented, but Lena, behind him, didn't utter a sound. They were still alive, barely. The air became thick with dust and smoke, the faint chittering of the Q-Thar replaced by the groaning of tortured rock and the distant screams of dying machines. When the tremors finally subsided, Kyle managed to wriggle free, emerging into a small, naturally formed cavern. Lena followed, her face streaked with grime, but her eyes, visible through the visor, were clear and sharp. "The main core is gone," she reported, her voice a low hum on their private comms. "Seismic activity suggests a complete structural collapse in Sector Gamma. Estimated fallout, total atmospheric contamination, and uncontrolled subsurface gas breaches, which means Xylos is now a dead moon." Kyle finished, surveying their new, temporary refuge. Good. His gaze drifted to a narrow fissure at the top of the cavern, a sliver of sickly orange light bleeding through the methane haze. "We climb." The escape from Xylos was less a planned extraction and more a desperate scramble for survival. They clawed their way out of the dying moon's internal organs, scrambling up treacherous rock faces, bypassing collapsing tunnels, and narrowly avoiding pockets of Q-Thar. Now disoriented and maddened by the destruction of their central energy source, the pheromones, without their constant output, were slowly dissipating, leaving behind a confused and terrified swarm. Kyle and Lena moved through the chaos like silent specters, their null nature a shield against the Q-Thar's remaining aggression, their training honed to a razor's edge by the sheer, unadulterated need to live. They found an abandoned auxiliary shuttle, a mere transport pod left for emergency evacuations, a relic from a previous conquered operation. Its systems were offline, its power core cold, but Kyle had always been adept at coaxing life from dead machines, a trait the Architectons had found useful for their sanitation crews. As Lena stood guard, her rifle a silent threat to the desolation around them, Kyle worked with a furious intensity, bypassing safety protocols, hot wiring circuits, and diverting power from the auxiliary thrusters to the primary drive. It was crude, dangerous, and utterly suicidal. But it was their only chance. With a shuddering roar that echoed across the lifeless moon, the shuttle's thrusters ignited, spewing plumes of toxic exhaust. They ascended through the choking atmosphere, leaving Xylos behind as nothing more than a broken toy in the Architecton's vast, indifferent playground. Their comms, still operating on emergency frequencies, crackled with static. Kyle knew it was only a matter of time before they were designated hostiles. He severed the connection to the Concord network, severing the last thread to their former lives. They were adrift, two nulls in a stolen shuttle, their only companion the vast, uncaring void. For weeks, they drifted, ghosting through asteroid fields and dead systems, living on scavenged rations and the dwindling power of their stolen shuttle. Kale, with Lena's silent support, had rerouted the shuttle's primitive sensors, adapting them to pick up faint energy signatures, discarded data packets, and the whisper of distant transmissions, anything that hinted at the Concord's activities without directly exposing them. Their null nature, once a mark of their servitude, was now their greatest asset. They were immune to the harmony, invisible to the Architecton's subtle psychic surveillance. They were silent voids in a galaxy that hummed with controlled thought. This meant they could listen, truly listen, to the whispers beneath the Concord's carefully curated peace. They intercepted fragmented reports of unforeseen atmospheric disturbances on Xylos, vague mentions of Q-Thar self-eradication events, and a chillingly brief commendation for the efficiency of the hyperaggression pheromone field test. There was no mention of the auxiliary legions, no casualties reported. They had simply ceased to exist. Kale's rage, initially a cold, calculated thing, began to burn with a slow, incandescent heat. It was no longer about survival, not purely. It was about exposing the lie. It was about making the Architectons pay. Lena, ever the pragmatist, saw the futility. "We are too," she stated, her voice a rare intrusion into their shared silence as Kale plotted a course through a nebular cluster, using stellar flares to mask their emissions. Against an empire that spans 1,000 systems, an empire whose very thought controls billions. They control minds, not machines. Kyle countered, his eyes fixed on the star map. They use their vastness as a shield, their harmony as a leash. But there are cracks. There are other nulls. And there are other species who chafe under their peace. Lena scoffed. A soft, almost imperceptible sound. The few other nulls we've ever encountered were either assimilated into the deeper reaches of conquered Black Ops or driven mad by the isolation. And the other species, they're crushed the moment they show dissent. Then we teach them how to fight, Kyle declared, his finger tracing a vector across the star map, leading away from known Concord space, toward the lawless, forgotten systems of the Outer Rim. We give them a voice. We show them the nulls are not broken. We are simply awake. Their first act of defiance was small, almost imperceptible to the vast Concord. They targeted an orbital relay station, a minor node in the Concord's vast network of propaganda dissemination. It broadcast the harmony, a constant, a soothing loop of Architecton-approved news, cultural directives, and spiritual guidance. Kyle, using his knack for electronic infiltration, and Lena, with her unparalleled precision, approached the station in their battered shuttle, cloaked by the solar winds of a dying red giant. They didn't aim to destroy it. Destruction was too blunt, too obvious. They aimed to disrupt. Kale slipped through the station's automated defenses like a shadow, his null nature a perfect camouflage against the psychic scans that pulsed through the structure. He bypassed firewalls, scrambled access codes, and, with a grim satisfaction, injected a raw, unedited data packet into the broadcast stream. It wasn't a message of rebellion, not overtly. It was simply the Xylos report, the unvarnished truth of the hyperaggression pheromone field test. No commentary, no call to arms. Just the facts. He let it loop for precisely 17.3 seconds before scrubbing his presence and initiating the stealth extraction. When they were safely back in the vastness of space, cloaked once more, Lena turned to him. 17.3 seconds, she repeated, her voice a rare murmur. An eternity in 1,000 systems, a blink in the void, enough to plant a seed, Kyle replied, watching the distant, shimmering outline of the now corrupted relay station. The Concorde would find it, of course. They would purge the data, punish the technicians, and reinforce their systems. But for 17.3 seconds, the truth had been spoken. For those few moments, any human within listening range who was slightly deaf to the harmony, slightly discordant, would have felt a jolt, a disquieting whisper in the constant hum. It was their first whisper back, their rebellion. A mere phantom at first, began to attract ghosts. The broadcast of the Xylos report, however brief, rippled through the subterranean currents of the Concorde's oppressed, not through official channels, but through the illicit data nets, the encrypted whispers of those who already harbored doubts. A few weeks later, deep in the crowded and lawless docking bay of a black market station called the Serpent's Coil, Kale felt a presence. It wasn't a physical sensation, but a subtle absence, a void in the constant hum of minds around them. Another null. It was like recognizing a face in a crowded room. But with only the absence of light, he and Lena had landed the unflinching resolve, now rechristened the Ghost Echo, under a false transponder, posing as cargo haulers. They were here seeking schematics for a more advanced stealth drive, something that could penetrate deeper into conquered space. Kale followed the void through the labyrinthine alleys, past stalls selling illicit weapons and questionable data. He found her in a dimly lit cantina, her back to the wall, a half-empty nutrient paste tube on the table before her. She was slight, almost fragile, her face partially obscured by the hood of a worn cloak, but her eyes, when she looked up, were fiercely intelligent, a predatory glint in their depths. Her name was Mara. She was a former Concorde cyber analyst, a null who had used her immunity to the harmony to infiltrate the deepest layers of Concorde data fortresses. She'd been on the run for months, ghosting through the galactic underworld, driven by her own burgeoning disgust with the Architecton's insidious control. "You broadcast the Xylos file," she stated, her voice a low, raspy whisper that carried above the cantina's din, meant only for him. Kyle simply nodded. "You saw it too." "I did more than see it." Mara replied, a flicker of something almost like a smile touching her lips. "I propagated it, cut the loop, and reseeded it. Millions of systems, billions of minds, for a fraction of a second." The harmony stuttered. The Architectons went into a full system panic. "I loved it," Kale felt a spark of something he hadn't felt since Xylos Hope. He had found an ally, a kindred spirit in the vast, cold darkness. He introduced her to Lena, who, after a moment of wary appraisal, offered a curt nod of acceptance. Mara became their comms and intelligence officer, a digital phantom capable of unraveling the Architecton's most guarded secrets. Through Mara, they began to piece together a larger picture of the Null diaspora, isolated, hunted, or manipulated. They were scattered across the Concord. Some were like Mara, using their gifts to survive. Others were slowly being driven to madness by their unique perspective. All were potential weapons against the Architectons. Their numbers grew slowly. A disgraced Concord engineer, a Null named Coda, who had been exiled for unorthodox power conduit design, read he'd built a reactor that couldn't be psychically controlled. A former Legionnaire named Silas, another Null, whose squadron had been deliberately sacrificed in a skirmish against a rogue AI for a combat simulation study. Each one was a shattered piece of humanity, discarded by the conquered, but now finding a purpose in Kyle's burgeoning rebellion. They cobbled together a rudimentary base of operations on a derelict asteroid station, hidden deep within a chaotic debris field, using Coda's engineering genius to restore its systems and Mara's cyber prowess to shield them from detection. It was a place of shadows and flickering lights, a sanctuary for the forgotten, a forge for their vengeance. The Architectons, in their infinite wisdom, were slow to react. To them, the disturbances were minor aberrations, like gnats buzzing around a star-forged monument. The Xylos core collapse was attributed to unforeseen geological instability and swiftly forgotten. The brief corruption of the Harmony network was dismissed as a malicious, unsophisticated virus that had been neutralized with minimal impact. The disappearances of a few Nulls from their designated auxiliary legion units or research facilities were registered, but barely noted. Nulls were expendable, and their inherent chaotic tendencies were well documented. Their reports were delivered by glowing, impassive Architecton drones to the Orbital Command Citadel Prime, spoke of maintaining equilibrium and purging logical inconsistencies. Kyle listened to these intercepted broadcasts with a grim smile. They were being underestimated. They were being dismissed. And that, he realized, was their greatest weapon. Their next strike was more ambitious. Mara had discovered a Concord research facility hidden on a gas giant's moon, where Nulls were taken for re-education, a euphemism for psychic suppression experiments designed to force them into the Harmony. Kyle knew the horror of it, the constant, maddening whisper of a song you couldn't hear, but felt tearing at the edges of your sanity. "They're trying to break us," Kyle stated to his growing crew gathered in the makeshift command center of their asteroid base. The holographic display shimmered, showing the facility's schematics. "They're trying to make us hear the song, or die trying." Lena, always practical, laid out the risks. The facility is heavily guarded, psychic dampeners, automated turrets, and at least 2 full platoons of Concord enforcers, not to mention the Architecton overseers themselves. "We're not going to blow it up," Kyle said, his voice quiet but firm. "We're going to open the cages. We're going to give them a choice: join us, or become another Architecton experiment." Coda, ever the engineer, pointed to a critical vulnerability: the psychic dampeners. "They're powered by a localized resonant frequency. If we could scramble that, even for a few seconds, the Architectons would be disoriented." Disoriented means vulnerable. Kyle finished. Silas, the former Legionnaire, cracked his knuckles, a feral grin spreading across his face. I like vulnerable. The raid was swift, surgical, and utterly brutal. They used a derelict cargo freighter, modified by Coda with rudimentary stealth plating, to approach the moon. Mara, a digital ghost, slipped into the facility's network, buying them precious seconds by spoofing sensor readings and delaying alarm protocols. The moment the dampeners flickered, thanks to Coda's precisely timed electromagnetic pulse, the screams began. The Architectons, exposed to the raw, unharmonized thoughts of the Nulls and their own enforcers, shrieked in pain, their crystalline forms flickering with uncontrolled energy. Kyle and his team moved like a precision drill, cutting through the disoriented enforcers. Lena, a silent hunter, picked off targets with unerring accuracy. Silas, a whirlwind of furious combat, tore through a squad of enforcers with a grim, cathartic joy. Kale himself confronted the lead Architecton, a towering, ruby-hued entity that tried to overwhelm him with a blast of raw psychic energy. Kyle felt nothing, only the dull impact against his armor. He returned the favor with a burst from his pulse rifle, shattering the Architecton's crystalline form into 1,000 shimmering fragments. They breached the Null containment cells. Inside, the Nulls were huddled, gaunt and terrified, their eyes wide with a fear born of endless psychic torture. Kale offered them a choice. You can stay here and die for their harmony, or you can come with us and fight for your freedom. Most hesitated, their minds still reeling, but a few, those who hadn't been completely broken, looked at Kyle with a flicker of recognition in their eyes, a spark of defiance, a shared silence. They joined. They were battered, bruised, but alive. And they had struck a blow not just against a facility, but against the very ideology of the Architectons. They had taken their broken toys and turned them into weapons. As the Ghost Echo jumped to FTL, carrying its new, silent passengers away from the exploding research facility, Kyle knew this was only the beginning. The Architectons had merely lost a few pawns, but Kale had found his voice, and it was a voice that whispered, not of harmony, but of fury. The silence of the new Nulls was different from the quiet comfort Kyle shared with Lena and his crew. It was a brittle, fractured thing, the sound of minds that had been stretched on the rack of the harmony until they were on the verge of snapping. On the cramped deck of the Ghost Echo, the 16 rescued Nulls huddled together, a tribe of ghosts haunted by the song they were forced to almost hear. They flinched at shadows, recoiled from sudden movements, and spoke only in ragged whispers, if at all. One of them, a young woman named Ilara with eyes the color of a faded nebula, would often stare at her own hands as if they belonged to a stranger, a symptom of the psychic disassociation the Architecton's torture had inflicted. Kale felt their fear like a static charge in the air, a stark contrast to the cold fury that had become his own engine. He was their liberator, but he was also a terrifying reminder of what they had endured. He, too, was a Null, but one who had somehow learned to weaponize the void within him, while theirs had become a prison. Lena watched them with a pragmatist's wary eye, her rifle never far from her hands. They are a liability. Kyle. She stated one cycle, her voice a low murmur in the ship's recycled air as they observed the group from the command bridge. They are traumatized, unpredictable. We don't have the resources to be a sanatorium. We were all liabilities once, Kale countered, his gaze fixed on Ilara, who was tracing invisible patterns on a bulkhead. They broke us and threw us away. The Concord made them this way. We either help them find their feet, or we become just like our masters, willing to sacrifice our own for convenience. His words hung in the air, a challenge and a promise. He assigned Silas, the grizzled former legionnaire, the unenviable task of trying to train them to coax the dormant fighter out from beneath the layers of trauma. Silas, for all his bluster and brutality, approached the task with a surprising, gruff patience, recognizing the same shattered look in their eyes that he had once seen in his own reflection. He didn't push them with drills. He started by teaching them how to reassemble a pulse rifle, how to focus on a simple, mechanical task to anchor their fractured thoughts. It was a slow, agonizing process, but for the first time since their re-education, the rescued nulls were being treated not as broken tools, but as people. The architectons, however, were no longer content to dismiss them as a statistical anomaly. The destruction of a research facility and the death of one of their own, however minor, was an act of blasphemy against the universal order. Mara, her fingers a blur across her holographic console, intercepted the Concorde's response. It wasn't a fleet, not a declaration of war. It was something far more insidious. A new voice had entered the harmony, a counter-melody of pure, focused intent. It spoke of a discordant contagion and of chaotic voids, threatening the serenity of the Empire. Kyle and his followers were no longer rebels. They were a plague. The Concord Media, 1,000 channels across 1,000 systems, began broadcasting carefully curated images of the destroyed facility, framing it as a tragic result of the Null's inherent instability. They showed fabricated footage of Kale's team executing helpless Concord enforcers, their faces digitally altered to appear monstrous, their actions twisted into acts of mindless terror. The Architectons weren't just hunting them, they were erasing their truth and rewriting it with a lie. "They've assigned a specialist," Mara reported, her face grim. Her console displayed a shimmering, crystalline symbol, an intricate lattice of light and shadow. It doesn't have a designation, just a title, The Weaver. Its purpose is to retune the dissonant threads of the harmony. It's a hunter. Kyle, a psychic predator designed specifically to track and neutralize nulls. The Weaver's influence spread like a cold fog. The harmony, once a gentle, persuasive hum, now had a sharp, interrogative edge. Nulls across the Concord who had lived their lives in quiet obscurity suddenly found themselves under intense scrutiny. Reports trickled into Mara's nets of nulls being rounded up, of psychic evaluations becoming mandatory in auxiliary legions, of entire colonies being put under a psychic quarantine. The net was tightening. They were no longer just ghosts. They were the galaxy's most wanted fugitives. The asteroid base, their small pocket of defiance, was no longer safe. The Weaver could be searching for them not with ships, but with its mind, feeling for the void they left in the psychic spectrum. "We need a place where the song can't reach," Kyle declared, looking at the star map that dominated the command center. "A place where the Weaver's senses are blind." It was a near impossible request. The harmony was omnipresent, woven into the fabric of conquered space. But Mara, ever the digital archaeologist, found a ghost in the machine. Digging through corrupted data archives from before the Architecton's rise, She unearthed fragmented charts of a system designated Sector 732, a region the Concorde had flagged as unnavigable hazardous. Within this sector was a single, terrestrial world Erebus. The old pre-Concorde reports were more myth than science, speaking of a Stygian anomaly, a unique magnetospheric phenomenon that created a permanent psychic dead zone. The world had been abandoned centuries ago after a series of violent solar flares made colonization untenable. It's a long shot, Mara admitted, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of the chase. The Concorde believes the system is empty, the planet a cinder. But if the anomaly is real, it would be the one place in the galaxy an architecton couldn't find us. The journey to Erebus was a desperate flight through the forgotten back alleys of the galaxy. They pushed the Ghost Echo's scavenged systems to their breaking point, Coda working miracles with bypasses and power shunts to keep the aging ship from tearing itself apart. They skimmed the edges of black holes to slingshot across sectors, navigated through graveyards of ancient warships, and played a constant game of cat and mouse with Concorde patrols that were now more numerous, more aggressive. The Weaver's influence was palpable. The patrols moved with an uncanny coordination, as if guided by a single, malevolent will. They were running low on fuel. Their rations were nearly depleted, and the ship's life support was beginning to fail. They were forced to make a supply run, a risky dive into a Concorde-controlled system on the outer rim. Their target was a Vok supply depot. The Vok were a reptilian species, brutish and powerful, subjugated by the Architectons and used as frontline enforcers, leashed by the Harmony. Their natural aggression was channeled into a dull, unwavering loyalty to the Concorde. To Silas, they were nothing but mindless thugs. The living clubs used to beat dissenting worlds into submission. He argued against the stop, the memory of fighting them still raw. Coyle, however, saw something else. He saw another species trapped in the same cage, just a different design. "We're not going to fight them," he explained, pulling Coda and Mara into the planning. "We're going to confuse them." The plan was audacious. Coda had been analyzing the resonant frequencies the Architectons used to pacify the nulls in the re-education facility. He believed he could create a localized, inverse frequency, not a weapon, but a disruptive signal, a burst of pure psychic static. It wouldn't break the Harmony's hold, not permanently, but it might be enough to jam it for a few critical minutes. As the Ghost Echo drifted towards the depot, disguised as a derelict freighter on a collision course, Mara sliced into the station's primitive comm system. The moment they were in range, Coda unleashed the pulse on the Vokman bridge of the supply depot. Chaos erupted. The dull glaze in the reptilian enforcer's eyes flickered. For the first time in generations, the soothing, controlling hum in their minds was replaced by a screeching, painful noise. They pawed at their heads, roared in confusion, their ingrained training clashing with a sudden, overwhelming sense of psychic vertigo. Some began fighting each other, their suppressed aggression lashing out at the nearest target. It was the perfect diversion. Under the cover of the chaos, Lena and Silas led a small team on a lightning-fast raid, using mag lifts to secure fuel cells and nutrient packs from the automated cargo bays. Kyle remained on the bridge of the Echo, monitoring the Vok's response. On his screen, he focused on one Vok in particular, a grizzled, battle-scarred chieftain whose command station was at the center of the bridge. While the others descended into mindless violence, This one stood frozen, its massive head tilted, its yellow eyes wide. It wasn't roaring in pain. It was looking around as if seeing the bridge, its comrades, and its own reflection in a console for the very first time. For a fleeting second, its gaze locked onto the Ghost Echo's position, not with aggression, but with a dawning, shocking awareness. Then the pulse faded, the harmony reasserted itself, and the glaze returned to its eyes. But Kyle had seen it, a crack in the leash, the seed of another rebellion, waiting for a different kind of rain. With their supplies replenished, they made the final desperate jump to Sector 732. The ship groaned in protest as it dropped out of FTL into a roiling sea of electromagnetic storms. Alarms screamed across the bridge as the anomaly battered their shields. Below them, wreathed in perpetual twilight and streaked with auroras of sickly green and violet, was Erebus. As they descended through the turbulent atmosphere, a profound and unnerving sensation washed over the ship. It wasn't a sound or a pressure, but an absence, the constant background hum of the harmony, a presence so pervasive that even nulls were subconsciously aware of its existence, simply vanished. For the first time in their lives, they were in a place of true psychic silence. Alara, who had been sitting in a corner of the bridge, looked up, her perpetually wide, fearful eyes blinking slowly. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. "It's quiet," she whispered, her voice filled with a wonder that was almost painful to witness. They had found their sanctuary. They had found their ghost world. But as the Ghost Echo settled into a hidden canyon, its hull groaning as it cooled, none of them saw the microscopic crystalline shard that detached from the landing strut. It had clung to them since their raid on the Vok depot, a silent, patient hitchhiker. Now, nestled in the dark soil of Erebus, its intricate internal lattice began to glow with a faint, pulsing light. It couldn't hear the harmony here, but it didn't need to. It began to transmit a single, repeating quantum-entangled pulse, a beacon, a thread for the Weaver to follow, pulling itself across the void to the one place in the galaxy its prey had thought was safe. The quiet of Erebus was a double-edged sword. For the rescued nulls, it was a balm, a soothing silence that allowed their fractured minds to begin healing. Ilara, no longer besieged by the psychic echoes of the harmony, started speaking in full sentences. Her insights into architect and psychology, gleaned from her torture, proving surprisingly sharp. The others, under Silas's patient tutelage, began to resemble soldiers, their movements gaining purpose, their eyes losing the haunted and vacant look that had defined them. They were a long way from an army, but they were no longer just survivors. For Kale, however, the silence was a vacuum, the rage that had fueled him, the constant pushback against an omnipresent enemy, now had nothing to press against. In the void, echoes of his own past began to surface the faces of Jax and Reese, the cold, clinical text of the Xylos report, the chilling realization of a life spent as an expendable tool. He poured his restless energy into building a future, directing Coda and his small engineering team to transform the canyon into a fortified, self-sustaining base. They repurposed the Ghost Echo's fusion core for power, tapped into subterranean aquifers for water, and used salvaged mining drones to carve out living quarters and training grounds from the canyon walls. Erebus became a testament to null ingenuity, a hidden fortress built from scraps and sheer will. Their sanctuary, however, was not as perfect as they believed. The crystalline beacon, the Weaver's silent herald, began its insidious work. It didn't transmit a signal in the conventional sense. It began to subtly alter the quantum state of the rock and soil around it. It was a slow, meticulous process, weaving a tiny, localized patch of psychic resonance into the dead zone of Erebus. It was a flaw in the silence, a single wrong note in a perfect chord, too subtle for their sensors to detect, but a flaw nonetheless. Weeks turned into months. Mara, now their undisputed intelligence chief, established a deep space listening post on one of Erebus's barren moons, using a network of scavenged probes to tap into the Concord's data streams. She brought them news of the galaxy they had left behind. The Weaver's purge was escalating. Nulls were being hunted with ruthless efficiency. The Concord's propaganda machine was in overdrive, painting Kale's burgeoning rebellion, now dubbed the Null Concordance by a few brave, anonymous sympathizers on the data nets, as a terrorist organization responsible for every unexplained explosion and sabotaged transport in the Outer Rim. They're building a narrative, Mare explained, her holographic form flickering in their newly built command center. They're turning us into the boogeyman. It's not just about killing us anymore. It's about making the galaxy want us dead. But there were other whispers, too. Whispers of dissent. The Vok, the brutish enforcers they had briefly unplugged at the supply depot, were showing signs of systemic insubordination. Minor acts at first, a delayed response to an order, a malfunctioning weapon during a civilian pacification, but the incidents were growing in frequency. Kyle's brief act of psychic sabotage had planted a seed of doubt, a fleeting memory of a moment without the Harmony's leash, on a dozen other worlds. Subjugated species who had heard the 17.3-second broadcast of the Xylo's report were beginning to stir, their simmering resentment given a new, terrifying focus. They weren't rebelling, not yet, but they were listening. "We need to give them a signal," Kyle stated, looking at the tactical map, a tapestry of simmering unrest. "Something bigger than a data leak. We need to show them that the Architectons can bleed." Lena, ever the voice of caution, pointed out their limitations. "We are a handful of soldiers on a forgotten world. A direct assault on any Concord stronghold would be suicide." "She's right," Coda chimed in, wiping grease from his hands. "But a direct assault isn't the only way to cripple a machine. The Architectons' greatest strength is their network. The instantaneous flow of information and control that the Harmony provides. If we could sever that, even in one sector—" Mara's eyes lit up. "The Chorus hubs." She brought up a schematic of a massive, orbital structure, a latticework of crystalline spires and resonating chambers. The Architectons use these to amplify and direct the Harmony. They're the nerve centers of their control. Each sector has one. They are the most heavily defended installations in the Concord, second only to Citadel Prime itself. "Then we hit one," Kyle said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "We cut the head off the snake in one sector and see how the body reacts." Their target was the hub in the Zephyr sector, an industrial region populated by a dozen different subjugated species, all simmering with resentment, all kept in line by the hub's relentless psychic broadcast. It was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The plan was a symphony of null capabilities. Mara would create a digital ghost in the hub's network, a phantom signal that would draw the bulk of the defensive fleet to a phantom threat on the far side of the sector. Coda designed a series of resonance torpedoes, crude but effective weapons designed not to explode, but to shatter the hub's crystalline amplifiers with a focused sonic frequency. The newly trained Nulls, led by Alara, who had discovered a chilling talent for predicting enemy movements, would fly escort in retrofitted mining drones, their immunity to the harmony making them the perfect screen against the hub's psychic defenses. Kale, Lena, and Silas would lead the main strike in the Ghost Echo. The night before the raid, Kyle found Lena in the armory, meticulously field-stripping her rifle. The silence between them was comfortable, familiar. "You think this will work?" she asked, not looking up from her work. "It has to," Kale replied. "We can't hide on Erebus forever. We either fight, or we die waiting." "We've done a lot of that," she murmured, a rare hint of weariness in her voice. "Dying." Kyle looked at her, at the hard lines of her face, the unwavering focus in her eyes. He saw not just a soldier, but the last true anchor to the life he had lost, the only other person who had stood with him in the silent, bloody aftermath of Xylos. "This time," he said, his voice a low promise, "we're not the ones who will be bleeding." The assault on the Zephyr Chorus hub was a masterpiece of controlled chaos. Mara's phantom signal worked perfectly, pulling the main conquered battle group on a wild goose chase. As the Ghost Echo and its squadron of makeshift fighters dropped out of FTL, they faced only the hub's automated defenses and a skeleton crew of enforcers. The battle was fierce. The automated turrets, unaffected by psychic interference, laid down a blistering field of fire. Two of the null-piloted drones were vaporized in the initial exchange, but the others, guided by Ilara's preternatural sense of the battlefield, weaved through the storm, their crude laser cannons scoring hits on the hub's power conduits. Coda's torpedoes, slow and clumsy, were the key. Kyle flew the Echo like a madman, using the ship's bulk to shield the torpedoes as they made their final approach. Plasma fire scored across their hull. Alarms shrieked, but they held their course. The torpedoes struck home. There was no grand explosion, only a discordant, screeching chime that echoed through space. The hub's crystalline spires fractured, the internal light that powered them flickering and dying. Across the entire Zephyr sector, the harmony went silent. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. On the factory world of Keelar, the reptilian Vok overseers, suddenly freed from their psychic shackles, turned on their architecton masters. On the mining asteroids of the Plexus Belt, a dozen different species laid down their tools and rose up, their long-suppressed rage erupting in a wave of violent, disorganized rebellion. The sector descended into anarchy. Kyle and his team, their ship battered but intact, watched the chaos unfold on their tactical display. They had lit the spark. The news of their victory, transmitted by Mara through anonymous channels, spread like wildfire across the galactic underground. The Null Concordance was no longer a myth. It was a force to be reckoned with. They had shown the galaxy that the gods of the Concord could be wounded, but as they celebrated their victory, a quiet, almost imperceptible hum began to emanate from a small, hidden canyon on Erebus. The Weaver, drawn by the thread of its beacon, had arrived. It didn't arrive in a ship. It simply coalesced. A shimmering, vaguely humanoid figure of pure, crystalline energy. It stood in the heart of their sanctuary, its multifaceted eyes taking in the evidence of their rebellion. It felt the lingering psychic residue of the gnolls, the defiant void that was their signature. It reached out with its mind, not with the gentle persuasion of the harmony, but with a cold, cutting precision. It found the faint, residual quantum entanglement of the beacon, and through it, it found a name, a thought form, a target. Cale Vance. On the bridge of the returning ghost echo, Cale suddenly staggered, a sharp, stabbing pain lancing through his skull. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't a voice, but a feeling, the chilling sensation of being seen, of having his deepest, most guarded thoughts laid bare and dissected by a cold, alien intelligence. He looked out the viewport at the serene, silent form of Erebus below, their sanctuary. "It's here," he whispered, a cold dread seeping into his veins, a dread he hadn't felt since the day he read the Xylos report. It found us. The hunter had come to their ghost world, and the true war for Erebus was about to begin. The Weaver's arrival was not an invasion. It was a contamination. The moment Cale felt its psychic touch, the sanctuary of Erebus transformed into a crucible of fear. The psychic silence that had been their shield now became an amplifying chamber for the Architecton's focused malevolence. It didn't attack with the brute force of the harmony. It was a surgeon, dissecting their minds with scalpels of personalized terror. In the newly built training grounds, Silas screamed, dropping his rifle as he was suddenly surrounded by the ghostly, accusing figures of his long-dead squadron, their armor riddled with the plasma burns that had killed them, their silent mouths forming his name. In the engineering bay, Coda watched in horror as his perfectly calibrated fusion core seemed to melt before his eyes, its containment fields flickering as imaginary radiation alarms blared in his head. The rescued gnolls, their minds still fragile, were hit the hardest. They collapsed, catatonic, or thrashed against invisible bonds, their silent screams echoing the psychic torture they had so recently escaped. On the bridge, Kyle stumbled back, his hand pressed to his temple as visions of Jax being torn apart by the Cuthar flashed behind his eyes, the phantom sensation of claws and chitin overwhelming him. Lena was at his side in an instant, her hand on his shoulder, her face a mask of cold fury. She, too, felt it, a subtle, insidious whisper suggesting their cause was hopeless, that Coil's rage would lead them all to ruin. But her discipline, honed over a lifetime of silent self-control, held firm. "It's in our heads," she gritted out, her voice a lifeline in the mental storm. "It's using our own minds against us." It was Ilara who gave them their weapon. She stumbled onto the bridge, her face pale but her eyes blazing with a fierce, unexpected clarity. The Weaver's attack, while terrifying, was a language she understood intimately. "It's a focal point," she stammered, pointing a trembling finger at Cale. "It's using you as an anchor to see the rest of us. It has to concentrate, to weave its illusions. It thinks our silence is a weakness, an empty canvas to paint on." Kyle straightened, the pain in his head sharpening into a razor-fine focus. He looked at Ilara, then at Lena, and the desperate, impossible plan began to form. "A canvas can be wiped clean," he said, his voice a low growl. "Mara, can you isolate its psychic signature?" Mara's holographic form was flickering erratically, a sign of the psychic interference bleeding into the ship's systems. I can try," she managed, her digital hands flying across her console. It's like trying to catch lightning in a bottle, but it has a core, a psychic center of gravity. It's located in the main canyon, right where we first landed. That's our target, Kale declared, his gaze sweeping across the bridge. Lena, Silas, take everyone who can still hold a weapon. You have one job. Hold the command bunker. The Weaver will use our own drones, our own defense systems against us. You are the wall. Buy us time. Lena nodded, her expression grim but resolute. She keyed her comm, her voice cutting through the rising panic. All combat-ready personnel. To the armory. Form a defensive perimeter around the command core. We are the line. Kale turned to Alara and the few other rescued Nulls who were still coherent, their faces etched with fear but also a glimmer of defiance. The rest of you are with me, he said, his voice radiating a certainty he didn't entirely feel. The Weaver thinks our minds are empty. We are going to show it what a void can really do. Alara, you're the anchor. You felt its touch. You can feel the threads. You're going to guide us. The plan was insane. A desperate gambit born of a profound understanding of their own nature. They couldn't fight the Weaver on its own terms. So they would drag it down into theirs. They would use their collective null state not as a shield, but as a psychic black hole. They would focus their shared nothingness, their absolute silence, and project it as a weapon. The battle for Erebus began. Lena and Silas, their minds a fortress of discipline and rage, organized the defense. Just as Kale predicted, the base's automated turrets swiveled and opened fire on their own positions. Mining drones, their programming corrupted, descended from the canyon walls like angry insects. It was a brutal, close-quarters fight, a desperate struggle to hold back their own creations. Meanwhile, Kyle, Alara, and a dozen other Nulls made their way to a small, isolated comms relay deep within the bunker, a place shielded by layers of rock and alloy. They sat in a circle on the cold metal floor, Kyle at the center. He closed his eyes, opened his mind, and screamed into the void, a raw, silent beacon of defiance. I'm here. Come and get me. The Weaver took the bait. The generalized psychic assault across the base receded, focusing with crushing intensity on Kale. The walls of the relay chamber seemed to dissolve, replaced by the chittering hellscape of Xylos. Reese appeared before him, the bony spike still protruding from his gut, his eyes filled with betrayal. You left us, Kyle, he whispered. You ran. Jax's massive form materialized, covered in blood and viscera. Your revolution is built on our graves. The Weaver's attack was relentless, a masterpiece of psychological warfare. It dredged up every failure, every doubt, every loss, and gave it a voice. Kyle felt his resolve begin to fracture, his rage dimming under the crushing weight of his guilt. But he was not alone. Now, Alara whispered, her eyes squeezed shut. She laid a hand on his shoulder, and the other Nulls did the same, forming a chain. They didn't try to fight the illusions. They didn't project thoughts of courage or defiance. They reached deep into themselves, to the core of their null nature, the silent, empty space where the harmony could find no purchase. And they pushed. It was not a projection of energy, but a projection of absence, a focused, weaponized void, the Weaver, its full attention dedicated to breaking Kale's mind, felt it as a sudden, shocking cold. The psychic energy it was drawing upon to sustain its form and its illusions began to drain away, not repelled, but simply nullified. It was like a fire being starved of oxygen. The illusions flickered. Reese's accusing face wavered, and Jax's form dissolved into static. The Weaver recoiled, confused. It had never encountered anything like this. It tried to sever its connection to Kyle, but it was too late. The Nulls' focused void was latched onto it, a psychic singularity from which its power could not escape. Outside, the battle raged. Lena's squad was down to its last few defenders, their barricade about to be overrun by the corrupted drones. Silas, roaring in defiance, stood over a wounded soldier, his pulse rifle glowing red-hot as he held back the final wave. Just as the first drone breached their defenses, they all suddenly froze, their optical sensors dimming. The automated turrets went silent. In the main canyon, the shimmering, crystalline form of the Weaver convulsed. It let out a silent, psychic scream that was felt as a wave of pure agony, even by the Nulls. Its form flickered violently, its internal light dimming as it was drained of the psychic energy that gave it substance. It withered like a dying star, collapsing in on itself until all that was left was a single, inert, man-sized crystal, lying inert on the dark soil of Erebus. The silence returned, not the false, imposed quiet of the harmony, but the true, deep silence of their sanctuary, now truly their own. In the aftermath, they counted their losses. They had lost 4 of the new recruits in the defense of the bunker. Silas had an arm broken in 3 places, but he was alive. The base was heavily damaged, but it had held. They had faced the Architect's finest hunter on their home ground, and they had won. Kale stood before the inert, crystalline shell of the Weaver. He placed a hand on its cold, smooth surface. It was just a rock now, a monument to a dead god. He looked up at the violet sky of Erebus, at the faces of his followers, bruised and exhausted but standing tall. They were no longer just refugees. They were an army, a new kind of army, one that fought not with fleets, but with will. He walked back to the command center, the last of his strength carrying him. Mara had already rerouted all remaining power to the deep space comms array. "The sector is in chaos," she reported, a weary but triumphant smile on her face. "The Zephyr rebellions are spreading. They're calling your name, Kyle. They're calling for the Null Concordance." Kyle looked at the tactical map. Where once there had been only the monolithic blue of the Concord, there were now dozens of flickering red lights, small fires of rebellion burning brightly in the darkness. He keyed the broadcast transmitter, linking into every illicit channel, every pirate frequency, every unmonitored relay Mara could find. His face, scarred and smeared with grime, appeared on 1,000,000 screens across 12 sectors. His voice was not the booming command of a general, but the quiet, steady tone of a man who had walked through hell and returned. "For generations, the Architectans have told you that their harmony is peace," he began. "They told us, the Nulls, that our silence was a flaw, a sickness. They were wrong. Today, on a forgotten world, we faced their ultimate weapon. We faced the mind that hunts minds. And we did not fight it with fire. We met it with silence. And it broke." He paused, letting the words sink in. "The Architect's power is a lie. It is a leash on your thoughts. But your will is your own. We have shown you the crack in their perfect order. We have shown you that gods can die." He leaned closer, his eyes burning with a cold, unquenchable fire. "We are the null concordance. We are the silence that answers the song. And our war has just begun. Find us. Join us. Be silent with us. And be free." The broadcast ended. Kyle slumped into the command chair, the adrenaline finally leaving him. Lena stood beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "What now?" she asked softly. Kyle looked at the star map, at the growing constellation of red lights. They were no longer just running, no longer just seeking revenge. They had a new purpose. "Now," he said, a faint smile touching his lips for the first time in an age, "we teach them how to live.